Hey guys, it's Mrs. Wallace from the couch, just making sure everybody's good. Um, I am just going to do a really quick video about natural monopolies just to make sure, whoop, there's my little smiley face, just to make sure everybody's got some of the notes for it. Okay, so just a quick thing about natural monopolies, but also regulated monopolies. And with regulating monopolies, this is all about something that we should probably note with regulating monopolies, it doesn't have to be a natural monopoly. Any monopoly can really be regulated. It just means that the government is coming in and is basically going to set a price or set a quantity. Remember that monopolists tend to underproduce and also tend to increase the price greater than perfect competition. So in a lot of cases, if we have a monopoly that perhaps is not going to be subject to antitrust law, it's possible that because of the type of industry it is, a natural monopoly is often serving because it has lower ATC, has economies of scale. So as a result, it might be the best model for a particular company. So this is really all about, those situations where the government steps in and the government steps in with the interest in regulating the monopoly. So why would the government really want to regulate? Oftentimes this is about keeping the prices low. Sometimes there's a product that a monopoly might be producing and we have an interest in keeping the prices low. So we saw this, for example, with some of the companies that might have a patent. The company that's producing EpiPen, for example, was keeping prices really, really high, and perhaps they could be regulated. We know that there are utility boards that monitor the price of utilities such as heating. So we wouldn't want our heating costs to be, so difficult. We're also now talking about things like, vaccines for coronavirus and whatnot. If those became available through a monopoly, we would want to make sure that the government regulated a monopoly so that the prices were low, free, that sort of thing. To make monopolies produce a greater quantity. Oftentimes monopolies underproduce, and because the price is high, we get this lower production, and as a result, we don't have enough of the good. It's a market failure, so we like to see greater quantity, and that's oftentimes what it is we're trying to do when we regulate. There's a couple of things that we can do. We might use price control, so the government can mandate a price by setting a price control. They effectively kind of override MR equals MC and suggest where the monopoly should produce. And based on the demand curve, we know then what the quantity will be. Oftentimes, we'll also see subsidies either to consumers, for example, to buy heat that might be very expensive, or we might see subsidies to a producer like PSE&G to make heat more available. So the costs of producing heat can sometimes also be subsidized. One thing we generally don't do is tax, right? If we had a situation where we had that downward sloping demand curve and a MR curve here, all that a tax is going to do is make your costs, which in a natural monopoly looks something like this, it's just going to shift your costs upward. And if we want to produce more of the good, shifting the marginal costs upward is not going to achieve that. So generally, we don't tax monopolies. Okay, so before we look at the graph, one last time, let's just go over this vocabulary, right? If the government is going to produce, sorry, I keep doing it, if the government is going to produce a price ceiling and regulate a natural monopoly, the question becomes, where should that price go? Okay, what is the best price? And one choice would be, of course, to say, well, where would the perfect competitor produce? That would be P equals MC, or allocatively efficient. Why don't we do it there? As we noted in our example graph, sometimes that puts the monopoly in a situation where they're making a loss, and we can't have a monopoly making a loss. They actually have a court case. It's kind of we're taking their property if the government regulates them. It's an eminent domain issue, a takings part of political constitutional law. So what courts have resolved is that monopolies could be told that they have to produce essentially the price that would be their break-even price. And this is sometimes referred to as the fair return price. And that's something you need to know, is the difference between the socially optimal price, which is where P equals MC, or the fair return price, which is where P equals ATC. This is where the monopolist would be receiving normal profit, breaking even, right? So let's look at the graph and kind of see how this maps out. Okay, guys, let's look at the graph just for a second. So what we have here is a graph of a natural monopoly. It looks a little different than the J. Wallace International, but it's got the same basic features, right? This long economies of scale for long-run ATC. We have the marginal cost curve that is kind of coming right up here. So we've got, that marginal cost curve. We also have the demand curve and the marginal revenue curve. Okay, so remember too, the monopolist is going to come along here if they weren't regulated at all. So an unregulated profit maximizing monopolist is going to produce right here, where MR equals MC, and they would actually charge this price here. This would be the monopolist price, okay? If the government comes in and says, listen, Mr. Monopolist, that price is way too high and that quantity is way too low, how about we do a price control? So the government might say, well, let's do price SO. If we do price SO, we'll get the quantity that's socially optimal. And at that point, the allocatively efficient quantity is given to society. However, the monopolists would earn a loss if they produce the socially optimal quantity and receive the price of PSO. That price is underneath the minimum ATC at the quantity that's being produced. So this amount here, if we shaded it, right, would be our loss. Okay, that's what the monopolist receives as a loss, and they would have a big old court case on their hands. So in an effort to make sure that doesn't happen, we'll see the government largely create the price right here, where the monopolist has its demand curve or its price equal to ATC. And at that case, if the price was here, okay, fair return price, if the price was here, we would be in a much better position. The quantity would not be socially optimal, would be a little less than socially optimal, but it would certainly be better than what the monopolist was producing. This idea of creating the fair return quantity and the fair return price is kind of a compromise of sorts, right? It's where the monopolist breaks even and has zero economic profit, but it's also where society gets greater quantity, lower price. Not quite allocatively efficient, but better than before. I hope that makes sense, and that's really all of the key features of a natural monopoly.